So tonight we're going to take a page out of Sam's playbook when he did Elba, and we're going to watch that short Bible movie, which is the same kind that he had. So hopefully this will work.
The book of Esther, it's one of the more exciting and curious books in the Bible. The story is set over 100 years after the Babylonian exile of the Israelites from their land. And while some Jews did return to Jerusalem, remember Ezra and Nehemiah, many did not. And so the book of Esther is about a Jewish community living in Susa, the capital city of the ancient Persian Empire. And the main characters in this story are two Jews, Mordecai and then his niece Esther. And then there's the king of Persia, who's something of a drunken pushover in this story. And then there's the Persian official Haman, the cunning villain. Now, this is a curious book in the Bible, mainly for the fact that God is never even mentioned, not once, which might strike you as kind of odd. I mean, isn't the Bible about God? But this is a brilliant technique by the author, who's anonymous, by the way. It's an invitation to read this story looking for God's activity, and there are signs of it everywhere. The story is full of very odd, quote, coincidences and ironic reversals, and it all forces you to see God's purpose at work, but behind the scenes. Let's just dive into the story. The book opens with the king of Persia throwing two elaborate banquet feasts that last a total of 187 days, and it's all for the grandiose purpose of displaying his greatness and splendor. On the last day of the banquet feast, he's really drunk, and he demands that his wife, Queen Vashti, appear at the party to show off her beauty. She refuses, and so in a drunken rage, the king deposes Vashti and makes the silly decree that all Persian men should now be the masters of their own homes. Then he holds a beauty pageant because he wants to find a new queen. This is like a really bad soap opera. But it's right here that we're introduced to Esther and Mordecai. Esther hides her Jewish identity and enters the beauty pageant and wins. And the king is so obsessed with Esther that he elevates her to become the new queen of Persia. Now, after this, and even more serendipitous, is the fact that Mordecai just happens to overhear two royal guards plotting to murder the king. And so he informs Esther, who in turn informs the king, and Mordecai gets credit for saving the king's life. Now, right here from the beginning, God's not mentioned anywhere, but this all seems providentially ordered. What is it that God's up to? You have to keep reading. We're next introduced to Haman, who's not actually a Persian. He's called an Agagite. He's a descendant of the ancient Canaanites. Remember 1 Samuel chapter 15. The king elevates Haman to the highest position in the kingdom, and he demands that everybody kneel before Haman. Well, when Mordecai sees Haman, he refuses to kneel, which of course fills Haman with rage. And when he finds out that Mordecai's Jewish, Haman successfully persuades the king to enact this crazy decree to destroy all of the Jewish people. And to decide the date of the Jews' annihilation, Haman rolls the dice. A die is called pur in Hebrew. Tuck that away for later. 11 months later, on the 13th of Adar, all the Jews will die. Haman and the king then have a drinking banquet to celebrate their really horrible decision. So the focus now turns to Mordecai and Esther, who are the only hope for the Jewish people. They make a plan that Esther's going to reveal her Jewish identity to the king and ask him to reverse the decree. But approaching the king without a royal request is, according to Persian law, an act worthy of death. So in a key statement, Mordecai, he's confident that even if Esther remains silent, that deliverance for the Jews will arrive from another place. And then Mordecai wonders aloud. He says, who knows? Maybe you've become queen for this very moment. Esther responds with bravery, and she purposes to go to the king with her amazing words, if I perish, I perish. Now, in what unfolds, we watch the ironic reversal of all of Haman's evil plans. So Esther hosts the king and Haman at a first banquet, and she says that she wants to make a special request of both of them at an exclusive banquet the following day. So Haman leaves the banquet totally drunk, and he sees Mordecai in the street. He fumes with anger, and he orders that a tall stake be built so that Mordecai can be impaled upon it in the morning. It seems like things can't get any worse for the Jews and for Mordecai. But all of a sudden, the story pivots. It just so happens that night the king, he can't sleep. And he has the royal chronicles read to him for good bedtime reading. And he just happens to hear about how Mordecai had saved the king's life. He had totally forgotten. So in the morning, Haman enters to request Mordecai's execution. And the king in that moment orders Haman to honor Mordecai publicly for saving his life. So now Haman has to lead Mordecai around the city on a royal horse, telling everyone to praise him. Now this moment in the story, it's a pivot for the whole book. It begins Haman's downfall and Mordecai's rise to power. Watch how this works. The day after is Esther's second banquet. So the king and Haman arrive, and Esther informs the king that first of all, she's Jewish, and second, that Haman has enacted a decree to murder her and to murder Mordecai, who saved his life, and to murder all of the Jews. Now the king's had a lot to drink, so when he hears this news, he goes into yet one more drunken rage, and he orders that Haman be impaled on the very stake he made for Mordecai. It's ironic and a grisly way for Haman to go. Haman's execution, however, doesn't solve the problem of the decree to kill all of the Jews. So the focus now turns to Esther and Mordecai as they make a plan to reverse the decree. They discover that the king can't revoke a decree that he's already made. So instead, the king commissions Mordecai to issue a counter-decree. On the appointed day that all of the Jews were supposed to be killed, the 13th of Adar, now the Jews are ordered to defend themselves and to destroy any who plotted to kill them. Then Mordecai, Esther, and Jews everywhere hold banquets and feasts to celebrate this new decree, and Mordecai is elevated to a seat beside the king. Eventually, the decreed day comes, and the Jews triumph over their enemies. First, they destroy Haman's family, and then any other Persian officials who had joined in Haman's plot. And then on a second day, they get permission to destroy any who plotted against them throughout the entire kingdom. This results in joy and celebration as the Jews are rescued from annihilation. The story then tells about how Esther and Mordecai established by decree this annual 2-day feast of Purim to commemorate their deliverance from destruction. And the name of the feast comes from Haman's dice. Remember, Purim. The book concludes with a short epilogue as Mordecai is elevated to second in command in the kingdom, and we are told now of his royal greatness and splendor as the Jews thrive in exile. Now, step back. Notice how this whole story has been designed. The story was full of moments of ironic reversal, but we can now see the whole story is structured as an ironic reversal, right down to the details. So the king's splendor and feasts and decrees are mirrored by Mordecai's splendor and feasts and decrees at the end. Esther and Mordecai, they first saved the king, but now in the end, they save all of the Jews. Then you have Haman's elevation and edicts and banquet that gets reversed by Mordecai's elevation and edict and banquet. And then at the center, you have Esther and Mordecai's planning scenes, and then Esther's 2 banquets that act as a frame around the greatest moment of reversal in the whole story, Haman's humiliation and Mordecai's exaltation. Beautiful. Another fascinating feature of this book is the moral ambiguity of the characters. There's a lot of drinking and anger and sex and murder, of which Mordecai and Esther are a part. Not to mention their violation of many commands in the Torah, like marrying Gentiles or eating impure foods. And so the story's not putting Mordecai and Esther forward as moral example, as if it endorses all of their behavior. But they are put forward as models of trust and hope when things get really bad. And so the book of Esther comes back to that question with which we began, why God is not mentioned. The message of this book seems to be that when God seems absent, when his people are in exile, when they're unfaithful to the Torah, does this mean that God is done with Israel? Has God abandoned his promises? And the book of Esther says no. It invites us to see that God can and does work in the real mess and moral ambiguity of human history, and he uses the faithfulness of even morally compromised people to accomplish his purposes. And so the book of Esther asks us to be willing to trust God's providence even when we can't see it working, and to hope that no matter how bad things get, God is committed to redeeming his world. And that's what the book of Esther is all about.
Those are good little movies to kind of help you get a whole picture of how things go. So our topic tonight is choices. So while the name of the author is unknown, the book was written by a Jew that was obviously familiar with Persian customs and words. Mordecai Ezra may have been the writer. The book takes its name from the beautiful orphan Jewish girl who became the queen of the Persian king Ahasuerus, or Xerxes, same person, who lived in the capital city of Shushan, or Susa, depending on which translation of the Bible that you have. So there's one of your answers. He's generally believed to have been King Xerxes I, who succeeded Darius I in 485 BC and ruled for 20 years over 127 provinces. That's important. He ruled from India to Ethiopia and all of Persia and Babylon. His kingdom was literally massive. You see it on a map. Looks like all of what we see today is Europe and Russia. It seems like it's all of that. Some scholars estimate that the population was around 50 million people that he was the ruler of. 20% of those people, around 10 million, at the low end, scholars say 750,000, were the Jews living there all through Persia, even though they had been free to return to Jerusalem for over 50 years. So I wrote a side note. When you have the opportunity to leave captivity, run. Too many people grow accustomed to living in captivity and never want to leave, even when given the chance. They actually get used to the demons, and as someone said recently, they keep the flesh on life support, nurturing it with their thoughts and turning its affections whenever life disappoints them. I know of situations where someone has been receiving deliverance, and in the middle of deliverance, they say, stop, that's enough. What if all of the Jews had been back in Israel? The whole mess in Esther would probably never have happened because they would not have been living in Persia. They would have been in Israel. So the story takes place over a period of 4 years, starting in the 3rd year of Xerxes' reign. Remember, the book of Esther overlaps Ezra and Nehemiah. So as we've said before, the book of Ezra would be like this long, and then there's the book of Nehemiah after that, and over the top of that is the book of Esther. So it's going on in Persia while we're hearing about what's going on in Jerusalem. So the books are all kind of simultaneous, put together. Some people think that Esther should have gone Ezra, Esther, Nehemiah, but obviously that's not what happened. So Esther would have been queen for at least 15 or more years. And then she'd have been the queen mother for many years after that. Do you remember in Nehemiah chapter 2, and it was verse 6, and this is when Nehemiah has gone to the king. Then the king said to me, the queen also sitting beside him, how long will your journey be? And he asked him a bunch of questions. So that person in Nehemiah would probably have been Esther. At that point, she could have been the queen mother, meaning the grandmother, but she's still sitting beside him on the throne. I think it's just interesting how long she was queen. And that Esther is a 4-year period of time, that book. Julie and I were talking today. I said, how long do you think the book took? And she said, well, maybe a year. Well, it feels that way, or a couple of years, I think you said, but it's actually 4 years. Won't it be interesting to get to heaven, Jeff has said this before, and watch all of the old movies of history, just to find out, I want to just sit for the whole 4 years and just watch what happened moment by moment, day by day. We'll have plenty of time. Now I'd like to just go through the book and look at some verses that I find interesting and helpful for one reason or another and explain why, as well as being sure I answer all of the questions for investigation since the reading was only through chapter 4. There are too many verses to cover, as the book of Esther has so much depth about how God works and chooses to move in our lives. You could literally have several sermons out of each chapter easily. Literally every chapter could be a sermon. And remember, Esther, maybe more so than any other book in the Bible, is about choices, hence the topic, choices. Good choices and bad choices, but all of them had consequences. I had put another side note in. This is why we must learn to hear Holy Spirit and make the right decisions, moment by moment, not just daily, not just weekly, because all of our choices, all of our decisions have consequences. Some might say, well, God knows the beginning from the end, and it is what it is, or que sera, sera. And no, our choices matter. Remember that Jeff taught in the big picture, I think is when he taught this, that God's foreknowledge and his predestination are separable. Well, that sounds really deep, and it is to some degree. In other words, just because God sees that something's going to happen in the future, that doesn't mean it's predestined to take place and that it will happen. The age-old question is so profound that in the opening narrative of One Night with the King, have you seen One Night with the King? The opening narrative, the narrator asks, from whence comes the purpose of one's life? Come it by chance, casting of the lot, or does a divine destiny beckon to each of us? Our choices can change things. So Pastor Jeff related this story. We're not going to read the whole thing, but in 1 Samuel chapter 23, David, if you remember, is with his men, and he's in the city of Keilah, and he asks the Lord, is Saul coming to this city to get me? And when he comes, if he comes, will the men turn me over? And God said, yes, he's coming to get you, and yes, the men are going to turn you over to him. So David gathers all his men and goes out the back door into the woods and never gets captured. And so what God said would happen never happened, because his foreknowledge and predestination are separable. As we're going to see, free will is found even in the book of Esther. So I put in here, there's a critical error. I don't know that I will call it an error and be that strong. But in this movie that we just watched, because the narrator said that God is not mentioned in the entire book of Esther. Does anybody else know what the other book is in the Bible where God's not mentioned? What's your favorite book? Song of Solomon. Song of Solomon. He's never mentioned there. But in reality, God is mentioned in Esther. Look at chapter 5, verse 4. So Ezra answered, if it pleases the king, let the king and Haman come today to the banquet that I have prepared for him. I have let me look here real quick. I have another verse I want to see where that's concerned. So I have a friend that I knew when I was working for Liberty Counsel with Matt Staver, and I was special advisor to the founder, and she was Latino. She, of course, spoke fluent Spanish. She also spoke very good English, but she was more fluent in Hebrew than she was in English, and just as fluent in Hebrew as she was in Spanish. And she said that if you go back to the oldest of oldest Hebrew texts, not Strong's Concordance, but the oldest of the oldest, when Esther comes into the king, and remember that he lifts the scepter to her, but when then she comes into him, she says to him basically, O king, my king. But in the Hebrew, that old Hebrew, what she says is O king, my king. You see? She implores her king first and says, O king, as if this is it, this is where we're about to land, and then says, my king. So in reality, in the old Hebrew, he is mentioned. This is very important because it completely changes, I think, how we look at the book of Esther. If you look at it from the point that God's not in it, supposedly, and he didn't say that. He said God is in it, but his name's not mentioned. But God is literally woven throughout every circumstance, every chapter, every verse of the book. This helps to confirm that Esther was not just a good Jewish girl, but also a Yahweh immersed and obedient, godly Jewish girl, that she would call on the name of God as she walked in to meet with the king. It was not just flippant. She called on God, and then she went to meet with the king. Now when we read Esther, I believe we have a whole new perspective. So as we said, the story takes place in Susa, which is the citadel or the capital of Persia. Queen Vashti, who was probably the great-granddaughter of Nebuchadnezzar. Remember Nebuchadnezzar, who took the children of Israel captive. She was probably the great-granddaughter of Nebuchadnezzar, who was the king of Babylon, who took the people captive originally. It could have been a political alliance for Vashti and Xerxes, rather than a romantic alliance, which kind of explains her attitude in the story. She gets dethroned by a very drunk King Xerxes who had been partying for days or weeks or even more. There were hundreds, listen, the party lasted 180 days plus 7 more, and there were hundreds or even thousands of men at this party. Queen Vashti was probably asked to appear naked before all of the men there, just to show her off, literally like a prized heifer in the county fair, which would have been offensive because remember, she was Babylonian royalty. She was the granddaughter of the king of Babylon. Why was she dethroned? You were right in the answer, because she failed to come before the king. So let me ask you a question. Was she right or was she wrong in defying the king? Somebody has to have a yes or no. Right or wrong? Yes. She was right. And the other. Oh, good point. So here's the other question. What if she had done what Xerxes had asked her to do? How would things have changed? Choices. You see? Because if she had not gone before Xerxes, he wouldn't have dethroned her. There would never be a need for Esther, and there would never be a protector for the Jews. So again, choices. Xerxes makes a choice to get drunk. Vashti makes a choice to refuse the king. Xerxes makes another choice to listen to bad counsel. Xerxes makes another choice to dethrone Vashti. If he had chosen differently, there would be no dethroning, no Esther as queen, no protection for the Jews. Do you see how choices matter? Choices matter. Now look at chapter 2, verse 7. Interesting verse. And Mordecai had brought up Hadassah, that is Esther, anybody have that open to read? His what? Uncle's daughter. So what was her relation to Mordecai? Cousins. The film said uncle. And that's an old Catholic tradition is where that comes from. And nobody knows why they developed that, but it comes from the Catholic tradition that he was her uncle and not her cousin. But in fact, they were cousins. She had neither father nor mother. Esther, whose name means star, whose Hebrew name was what? We just read it. Hadassah means myrtle. She is one of the virgins who comes to prepare to go before the king. So look at chapter 2, verse 12. Each young woman's turn came to go in to King Ahasuerus or Xerxes after she had completed 12 months' preparation according to the regulations for the women. For thus were the days of their preparation apportioned, 6 months with oil of myrrh and 6 months with perfumes and preparations for beautifying women. What's interesting is that the phrase preparations for beautifying the women in the old Hebrew language means to scour and to polish. 12 months. Essentially, the first 6 months was thought of as a cleansing, hygienic exfoliation, followed by 6 months of refinement with oils and fragrances. Remember, many of these girls, remember the land was mostly what then? Desert. Many of these girls had come from dry desert lands. They would have been tanned, which is not good when you're royalty, because royalty didn't have a tan because they never worked in the fields. They were never outside. So to have a tan meant that you were poverty. And so they would have had a tan. They'd had dry, cracked leather skin. There was 6 months to scour them and get all of that, and then 6 months to polish them, as it were. So it was not just a 12-month sauna. There was some real work involved in this, as well as they would have had very strict dietary restrictions. So when you look at verse 14, I think it's verse 17. No, it is verse 14. In the evening she went, this is talking about the girls. So each young girl went to the king when she was given whatever she desired to take with her. In the evening she went, and in the morning she returned. But where did she return when she came out from being with the king? To the second house of the women, to the custody of Shagaza, the king's eunuch who kept the what? Concubines. She would not go into the king again unless the king delighted in her and called her by her name. It is important to see that going in to see the king, the movie said a beauty pageant, was not a beauty pageant. It was not an interview. The virgin girl would sleep with the king in the hopes that she would please him and be chosen as queen. If not, she left and went into a house for the king's concubines to live out her life, waiting for the time, if ever, that she would once again be summoned by the king. So this wasn't a party. It wasn't something they looked forward to, these girls. They had one shot. So think about this. If Esther goes in as a Jewish virgin girl, she potentially has to sleep with a king and end up as a concubine. And Mordecai asks her to go. However, not Esther. Verse 17 says, the king loved Esther more than all the other women, and she obtained grace and favor in his sight more than all the other virgin. This verse implies that Esther found God-given grace and favor in the eyes of the king without having to physically sleep with him. Grace and favor, the Hebrew words that are used several times in this story, the implication in the Hebrew is that when he saw her, something about her made him feel graciousness, kindness, and mercy toward her. He immediately puts the crown on her head and she becomes queen. God orchestrates literally love at first sight. So the picture is Esther goes in to see the king. The king looks at her and basically says, whoa, there's the one. And he puts the crown on her head, and so she does not have to violate her moral convictions because God intervenes. Again, God's power and influence is woven throughout this entire book. In chapter 3, the villain Haman comes along. Verse 1 tells us that he was an Agagite. So everyone, I think, that wrote it up there got that right. I want you to look at, if you have your Bibles, you can turn to this, 1 Samuel chapter 15, starting at verse 3. Interesting story. So this is where Saul is going against the Amalekites. And Samuel says to him, this is what the Lord says, go and attack Amalek and utterly destroy all that they have, and do not spare them, but kill both man and woman, infant and nursing child, ox and sheep, camel and donkey. Then if you flip over to verse 18, Samuel's confronting Saul, and he says, the Lord sent you on a mission to go and utterly destroy the sinners, the Amalekites, and fight against until they're consumed. Why then did you not obey the voice of the Lord? Why did you swoop down on the spoil and do evil in the sight of the Lord? So jump to verse 32. Well, go back to 20. And Saul said to Samuel, I have obeyed the voice of the Lord and gone on the mission which the Lord sent me. And I brought back Agag, king of Amalek. I've utterly destroyed all the Amalekites. But the people took the plunder, sheep and oxen, the best of the things which had been utterly destroyed. And then Samuel confronts him in verse 32. He said, bring the king to me. King comes thinking it's going to be great. And Samuel says, as your sword has made women childless, so shall your mother be childless. And Samuel hacked Agag in pieces before the Lord in Gilgal. Historians believe that King Agag's wife probably was spared with him, because it would have been the tradition of the day that if you spared the king, you spared the wife. And that his wife was either pregnant or had a child with her, and that they were not killed. Agag was killed, but they didn't kill the woman. So probably she was pregnant, which is why they didn't kill her. And she has a child, and therefore Haman, in this story, is the great, great, great grandson of King Agag, an Agagite. Samuel made a choice that almost annihilated the children of Israel generations later. It's pretty. If he had killed King Agag, there would never have been a Haman. The choices we make now literally become generational choices that will have influence for generations and generations to come. If we could just get that one point in our heads. So, as we know, Haman hates Mordecai because Mordecai refuses to bow down to him, and subsequently he hates all the Jews. He convinces the king to issue a decree that all of the Jews were to be slaughtered. As we know, Mordecai encourages Esther to go before the king and present her case and the case for her people. We know the story of how she chooses to do what Mordecai asks and gives a reply that's very famous. If you see in chapter 4, verses 13 through 16, Mordecai says to Esther, this is probably the most famous passage in the book of Esther. Do not think in your heart that you will escape in the king's palace any more than all the other Jews. For if you remain completely silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise from the Jews from another place, but you and your father's house will perish. Yet who knows whether you've come to the kingdom for such a time as this? Then Esther told them to reply to Mordecai, go, gather all the Jews who are present in Shushan and fast for me. Neither eat nor drink for 3 days, night or day. My maids and I will fast likewise. And so I will go to the king, which is against the law. So we have talked before about how obedience means always obeying those in authority over you. She chooses to, but why did she choose to? Because God led her to disobey the law. And if I perish, I perish. This again shows how God is woven throughout the whole book. See the spiritual sensitivity of Esther. She knew the process, humanly speaking, of approaching the king without being summoned. And she knew that there must be a spiritual process as well. And so she asked for all of the Jews in the kingdom to fast and pray, no food and no water for 3 days. And obviously, all of them obey and do what she's asked them to do. What I love about Esther is that she's not haphazard or reckless. She is mindful, wise, and seeks the Lord as to his protocol. Which again is why it's important to know that she implores the Lord, O king, my king, because she had a heart for the Lord. She wasn't a random Jewish girl. She exemplifies the perfect posture, even to the point of breaking the law. She was led by Yahweh to do this, willing to suffer the consequences, either life or death, because she trusted her God. Who else have we seen in the Bible that had that kind of faith? Abraham. He was willing to sacrifice Isaac. Why? What does it say in the book of Hebrews? He was willing to sacrifice his son because he knew that if he killed him, what would happen? God would raise him from the dead. Again, the hand of God woven throughout the whole story of the book of Esther. When she goes before the king, she asks for what? You got it right on the screen. She asks for the king and Haman to come to a banquet. How many banquets? Two different banquets. All the commentaries I read, nobody has an explanation as to why there were 2 banquets. She just decided to do 2 banquets. And what was that? They were hungry, yeah. In the meantime, back at the ranch, so to speak, Haman is very angry about Mordecai, goes to see his wife and his family, and his wife and family say, do this, build a gallows for him. One of the things I did learn on the movie and then research to see if it was true was I always viewed a gallows as what we normally see the gallows as in the Old West, where it was a platform with a hole that would fall and a rope around their neck and they would hang them. But in fact, this is accurate, what you saw here. But that gallows was probably 75 feet tall. So 75 feet, this ceiling's about 20. So it's almost 4 times as tall as this ceiling. A pole that long sharpened on the end where they would impale a person. Why? Because it was a sign of arrogance. Because you put a person on the pole and impale them and stand them up 75 feet in the air, and they can be seen for miles in that countryside because it's so flat. They can be seen for miles. It was for all to see and to fear. Haman was doing this so that the whole countryside would fear him. He was going to hang Mordecai. It was a choice, another choice, a choice that cost him his life as the king had him hung on his own gallows. So this is correct when you saw the poll. That is exactly how that would have worked. So Esther goes to the king and she pleads for the lives of the Jews. The king wants to do this for her. However, let's go back and look at chapter 3, verse 10. Chapter 3 and verse 10. The king took his signet ring from his hand. It's very important. He takes his ring from his hand. He gives it to Haman, the son of Hammedatha the Agagite, the enemy of the Jews. And the king says so on and so forth to him. So if you jump then to chapter 8 and verse 7, the king says to Ahasuerus and Queen Esther and Mordecai, I've given Esther the house of Haman, and they have hanged him on the gallows. You yourselves write a decree concerning the Jews as you please in the king's name and seal it with the king's signet ring. For whatever is written in the king's name and sealed with the king's ring, no one can revoke. So the story is the king, of course, tells them that they can go and fight for their own lives. And he says, but you have to write a decree, and I'll give you my ring, and you can sign it with my signet ring, and then it can't be reversed. I put this note: leaders, be very careful who you give your ring to. Because when you hand them your ring, you hand them your authority. There's a huge difference between giving your ring to Haman or giving your ring to Mordecai. So Mordecai writes letters that give the Jews permission to protect themselves. Verse 8, or chapter 8, verse 11, he says, by the letters the king permitted the Jews who were in every city to gather together and protect their lives, to destroy, kill, and annihilate all the forces of any people or province that would assault them, both little children and women, and to plunder their possessions. However, interestingly, when you read that, look at chapter 9 and verse 5. It says this, thus the Jews defeated all their enemies with the stroke of the sword, with slaughter and destructions, and did they please with what they hated. And then in verse 10, they killed them, but they did not lay a hand on the plunder. If you look up at verse 16, they killed 75,000 of their enemies, but they did not lay a hand to the plunder. They chose not to take the plunder. The emphasis of this story is that their actions were solely for self-defense and not motivated by greed or personal gain. By refusing to take spoils, the narrative portrays their fight as a righteous act of survival rather than a desire for wealth or revenge. Now, think about this also. Some people still decide to come against the Jews. But the decree says if they come to fight against you, you can fight for yourself. You do whatever it takes to protect yourself. And so they do, and they kill 75,000 of the enemy, and not one Jew dies. Again, the providential hand of God operating where they're protected because of a new decree. After this victory, Mordecai institutes the Feast of Purim to be celebrated every year. So that would have been the question that was asked. It was the Feast of Purim. The Jews still celebrate this feast even today. Like Hanukkah, the Feast of Purim has largely developed into more of a national holiday than a religious one, although it most often starts with the reading of the entire book of Esther. So they start this feast, they read the entire book of Esther. The celebration also involves giving gifts of food to friends, charity to the poor, and a big meal. Then the book of Esther is read. When the book of Esther is read, the audience joins in cheering when Mordecai's name is read and shouting and booing when Haman's name is read. Have you seen that remember that on The Chosen? Any of you that watched The Chosen? They showed that where they cheered and they booed. So the capstone of the whole book, the whole story, is found in chapter 8, verses 15 through 17. So after Mordecai writes his decree, so this is before the battle, but all the Jews, there is one verse that I didn't read to you that says that when Haman and the king made the decree, then they went back to having their party, their festival, their banquet. But all of the Jews were in confusion and fear. So because the decree had gone out that they were going to be killed within a certain period of time, they were in confusion and in fear, knowing that this was going to happen. So after Mordecai has the new decree made, in verse 15 of chapter 8, so Mordecai went out from the presence of the king in royal apparel of blue and white, with a great crown of gold and a garment of fine linen and purple. And the city of Shushan rejoiced and was glad. The Jews had light and gladness, joy and honor. And in every province and every city, wherever the king's command and decree came, the Jews had joy and gladness, a feast and a holiday. Then many of the people of the land, listen, many of the people of the land became Jews because the fear of the Jews fell upon them. So by Mordecai's decree and Esther going into the king, many people become Jews, become, quote, believers, because there's so much joy in the camp. Beautiful story. So that's the capstone of the whole book. The practical application for tonight is similar to what we have discussed in a lot of the past few weeks. It's imperative that we learn to listen, hear, and choose to obey the voice of the Lord. This book is wrought with choices, people making choices, and the impact that those choices have. And the application is you have to learn that your choices, every choice you make, has some kind of a consequence. There's not a choice you make that doesn't have a consequence. Good consequence, bad consequence, minor consequence, major consequence. The definition of obedience is doing exactly what you are told to do, immediately when you are told to do it, with the right heart attitude. That's obedience. Here's a good illustration that I like. So there was a little boy one day, and he was watching TV, laying in the living room watching TV. And his mom came up, and she said, Johnny, I don't know if his name was Johnny, we're going to call him Johnny. Johnny, I need you to get up right now, and I want you to go get the trash out of the kitchen, tie it up in one of those white bags, and I want you to take it out and put it in the trash can on the deck and put the lid on it. So Johnny says to her, Mom, I'll be glad to do it, and I'll do it. Can I do it in just a little while? I'm watching a show. Obedience or disobedience? Disobedience. He did it later. It's still disobedience. Another scenario. He says, sure, Mom, I'll be glad to do it. So he gets up, kind of in a hurry, runs in the kitchen, grabs a bag, doesn't put it in the white trash can, takes it out, throws it in the can, doesn't put the lid on. Obedience or disobedience? Disobedience, because the bag got in the trash. Or he says, fine, I'll do it. I'll do it right now. And he gets up and he stomps in the kitchen and he grabs a bag and he throws it in there and he's mumbling the whole time and he takes it out and he opens the lid and he puts it in, puts the lid on, does exactly what she tells him to do. Obedience or disobedience? Disobedience, because he has the wrong heart attitude. When we hear the voice of the Lord, we have to do what we're told to do immediately with the right heart attitude in order for it to be obedience. Parents must teach this principle to their children, which is frankly not going very well in today's society. So they will learn, this is why they must do that. They must teach their children to obey that way, because otherwise they will not know how to obey who? God. You're teaching them obedience as a child only for the reason that you want them to learn how to obey God when the time comes. And because so many young people today do not know how to obey their parents, they never learn how to obey Father God. And there's so much destruction. Right now, because in much of the church, not to mention the whole of America, they don't make very good choices. As we said, We said this earlier, and this is really important. As we said earlier, people keep their flesh on life support just in case they might want to dabble in their own junk again at some point. We must learn to kill the flesh and die. You can't have the flesh on life support. I thought it was a great illustration of how so many people live. They live for the Lord, they want it, but they just keep that flesh just right there. It's still alive just in case they need it later. The great American philosopher Dallas Willard said this: social and political revolutions have shown no tendency to transform the heart of darkness that lies deep in the breast of every human being. And amid a flood of techniques for self-fulfillment, there is an epidemic of depression, suicide, personal emptiness, and escapism through drugs, alcohol, cultic obsession, consumerism, sex, and violence, all combined with an inability to sustain deep and enduring personal relationships. He goes on to say, so obviously the problem is spiritual, and so must be the cure. So as we enter into this season, let's remember who the cure is, and let's remember whose birthday it is. I was teaching a Sunday school class years ago, and it was just about this time of year. And I sometimes can be snarky. Sometimes. And so I went to class that day, and was teaching about 50 people in the class, and I'd gone to the Dollar General and gotten those little Christmas boxes that are boxes that you can put a gift in, but they're already kind of, they look like they're wrapped, and they're just so easy. It makes things so cool. So I got about 30 of those, and I put them in a big bag. And so when I got to Sunday school that morning, I said, I think that we forgot somebody's birthday recently. Who had a birthday? The very last person had a birthday. And someone said, Roger did. I'm like, oh yeah, Roger, stand up, man. So Roger stood up. And so I took the bag and I started walking around the room. And as I walked around the room, I handed everybody a little box. And I said to them, happy birthday, Roger. And then I had somebody, happy birthday, Roger. And I took all the boxes, about 30 of them. When I got done, I walked back up. And someone said so perfectly in the audience, you forgot Roger. And I said, welcome to Christmas. It's not our birthday. It's the birthday of the Son of God. And if you went to your own birthday party and they put you in a table over here and it had your name on the table and then everybody sat over here and they had a great birthday and they had cake and ice cream and opened gifts and gave gifts to each other and nobody gave you a gift, you wouldn't feel very much like it was your birthday. And so I think that it's important that we remember during this season as we make choices to choose to remember whose birthday it really is. Because of him, the cure for society is available. So obviously the problem is a spiritual one, and so must be the cure. We have a God of amazing foreknowledge and predestination who gives us the right and the privilege to choose who and what we will choose. My friends, choose well. Amen? Let's look at celebration, and we'll be going home. Celebration of knowledge. After all that, we ought to get a whole bunch of these right. So, the story of Esther takes place in what city? We're not going to take a lot of time because you either know it or you don't. So, we have 7 people vote and 7 Shushans. Very good. Excellent. Next question. Why was Queen Vashti dethroned? Because she was too old, the king loved someone else, she refused to come, or she ran away. 7 people. And we have 7, 100%. Good job. Next question. How was Mordecai related to Esther? Father, cousin, uncle, or not related? We've got 7 for cousin. Good job. The beautification process for Esther and the other virgins took how long? A month, a week, a year, 3 days. We've already got 7 votes. Wow. And we got 100%. Next question. What request did Esther make of the king? More gold and jewels, asked him to a banquet to leave her alone, or additional servants? 7 vote. And we got 100%. Good job. The king was able to reverse his initial decree. True or false? 7 and 100%. Good job. Next. I have to read up here. What feast was celebrated to mark the time when the Jews were delivered from the death decree? The Feast of